Once a proud and majestic stallion, Midnight now stands as a mere shadow of himself. Years of mistreatment have broken his spirit, and he's no longer the horse he once was. His dark coat has lost its shine, and his once bright eyes now hold only weariness. Midnight moves slowly, as if burdened by the weight of his past. His body is bruised, and his heart is heavy with the scars of abuse, leaving him a shadow of his former free-spirited self. Every step Midnight takes is a reminder of the pain he's endured. His muscles tense at the slightest touch, and fear overwhelms him. He's trapped in a cage of his own terror, unable to trust anyone. Though his heart longs for freedom, he remains still, too scared to move, a prisoner of his past. His instincts scream for escape, but Midnight is immobilized by his own fear, longing for a time when he was free. Emma is drawn to Midnight, feeling an unexplainable connection to him. She sees the hurt in his eyes, and it breaks her heart. Her desire to help him is overwhelming, but she feels the weight of the world against her. She's just a girl, and Midnight's scars go deeper than she can imagine. But she won't turn away. She has to try, even if it seems impossible. Emma's father watches her with quiet worry. He knows his daughter's heart, how deeply she feels for Midnight. But he also knows the harshness of the world, the cruelty that exists. He fears for Emma, knowing how easily her compassion could be broken. She's strong, but he wonders if she's ready for the reality of trying to save a soul like Midnight's. Midnight stands at the auction, a mere object to be sold. Emma watches in horror as potential buyers examine him without care, seeing only a price tag. Her heart aches as she knows that whoever buys him will likely continue the cycle of abuse. She feels powerless, trapped in a system that values money over compassion. The auction continues, and Emma's worst fear becomes a reality: someone will buy Midnight. But she doesn't know who, and she fears they won't be kind to him. Her desire to save him grows stronger, but the reality is crushing. She feels helpless. The world is a cruel place, and the fight for Midnight's freedom is one she might not win. Emma stood quietly by Midnight's side, her heart heavy with the weight of his pain. His eyes, once full of life, now seemed lost, his spirit flickering like a flame in the wind. She reached out a trembling hand, wanting to comfort him, but she knew better. Midnight had been hurt before. She saw it in the way he flinched when anyone came too close. The scars on his body were only a small part of his torment, it was the unseen wounds, the ones deep inside, that made her ache the most. She felt his fear as her own, and it was almost too much to bear. She wanted to help him, to take him away from this life of suffering. But what could she do? She was just a young girl. The world around her was so much bigger, so much colder, and the strength she needed seemed so far out of reach. Her love for animals burned fiercely within her, but it was hard to see how that love could ever overcome the brutal reality of the world they lived in. She clenched her fists at her sides, trying to steady her racing thoughts. Every instinct in her told her that she had to act, that Midnight was counting on her. But Emma felt small, powerless against the forces of indifference that controlled the lives of animals like Midnight. The cruelty of the world felt so vast, so all-encompassing, and here she was, just a girl, caught in the middle. It was a helpless feeling, one she had never known before, but it was all too real. She stared at Midnight, her heart breaking for him, and in that moment, she promised herself she would do whatever it took to save him. Even if the odds were against her. Even if the world seemed too cold to care. She would try. She had to. The auction was a spectacle of cold indifference. Midnight stood motionless in front of the crowd, his head lowered, the weight of years of pain evident in every weary step he took. His body was bruised, his once glossy coat dull and scarred, yet it was the emptiness in his eyes that caught Emma's attention the most. Those eyes told a story of torment, one that no amount of money could heal. But no one seemed to notice. To the bidders, Midnight was just another horse. A commodity to be bought and sold. Emma felt a chill run through her as she watched Midnight being paraded in front of the buyers. Each bid that was placed seemed to echo in her ears, a stark reminder of how little value the world placed on the life of an animal like Midnight. He was nothing more than a price tag in this cold, heartless place. The bidding continued, and with each increase, her chest tightened, her stomach knotting with dread. She couldn't help but picture Midnight's future in the hands of these strangers, hands that would likely continue the cycle of abuse. They didn't see him. They didn't see the broken spirit beneath the bruises. They only saw dollar signs. Emma clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as the bidding escalated. Her heart raced as she felt the growing distance between herself and Midnight, the growing sense of helplessness weighing her down. She wanted to cry out, to stop the auction, to run to Midnight and take him away from all of this. But she knew she couldn't. The coldness of the auction house was too strong. It had a grip on her, too. As the auctioneer called out the final bid, Emma's worst fear came to life. Midnight would soon belong to someone else, someone who might not care for him the way she did. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. The auction had ended. Midnight stood at the center of her thoughts like a haunting image that wouldn't fade. Emma stared at him from the shadows, her heart heavy with a promise forming deep within her. She knew, deep down, that no one else would step forward to save Midnight. The auction had shown her how cold the world could be, how indifferent people were to suffering as long as it didn't affect them. But Emma couldn't look away. She couldn't ignore the way Midnight's eyes seemed to beg for help. No one else would fight for him, so she would. She clenched her fists, a fire burning in her chest. She would bring him home. She would find a way, no matter the cost. Her thoughts raced as she turned toward her father, his back turned as he spoke with others, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. She had to ask. She had to try. She swallowed the lump in her throat and walked toward him, her legs feeling heavier with every step. She couldn't let Midnight suffer any longer. "Dad," Emma began, her voice shaky. He turned to face her, his brow furrowed in concern. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Can we afford to buy Midnight? I know. I know it's a lot, but he needs us." She described Midnight, his broken spirit, the sad emptiness in his eyes, his fear. She told him about the way he stood there, lifeless, as if his soul had been crushed. She pleaded with her father to understand. Her heart pounded in her chest, but Emma didn't wait for an answer. She had already promised Midnight, and she would do whatever it took to keep that promise. The decision to save Midnight came with a heavy price. Emma spent the following days weighing her options. She had to act quickly before Midnight was taken by someone else. But how could they afford him? Her father had said it was a stretch, but they might be able to make it work if they sacrificed enough. Emma walked into her room, where her most cherished possessions sat on shelves, her beloved necklace, the one her mother had given her before she passed. The necklace had been a symbol of family, of love. It was the last piece of her mother she had left, and the thought of parting with it broke her heart. But Midnight needed her. Midnight needed them. With a deep breath, Emma walked to the shelf, her fingers brushing the cool metal. She closed her eyes and whispered a goodbye to the memory it held. She took the necklace in her hands and walked to the pawn shop. The pain in her chest was almost unbearable, but she knew it was necessary. When she returned home, empty-handed except for the money in her pocket, she knew the true cost of her decision had only begun. She had sold not just an item, but a piece of her past. And though the sorrow lingered, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope creeping in. She was one step closer to bringing Midnight home. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay awake, clutching the money in her hands, wondering if this was enough. The sacrifice felt deep, but it was a sacrifice made out of love and a promise she had made to Midnight. She closed her eyes, knowing that when morning came, she would fight for him. The moment Emma brought Midnight home, the atmosphere shifted. Her heart beat fast as she led him into the barn, where the air was still, filled with the scent of hay and fresh straw. Midnight was stiff with fear, his dark eyes wide, looking around as if expecting the next blow. Emma approached slowly, speaking in soft tones. She had worked with animals before, her whole life had been about understanding them. But Midnight wasn't just any animal. His wounds were more than physical. She knew he carried the weight of pain, betrayal, and fear that no one should have to bear. She needed him to know he was safe now. She reached for the bag of apples she had brought with her. Midnight flinched as the bag rustled. Emma's heart dropped, but she didn't move back. Instead, she gently placed the apple in the straw in front of him, letting him see that she wasn't trying to hurt him. "Here, Midnight." "It's okay," Emma whispered, her voice trembling with both hope and uncertainty. Midnight eyed the apple warily, sniffing it from a distance. His body tensed, as if every fiber of him screamed to run. Emma crouched low to the ground, keeping herself small, non-threatening. She waited. She needed to show him that there was no danger here. Minutes passed, but Midnight didn't move. Emma didn't speak. She just sat there, her patience stretching thin, but she refused to leave. Slowly, Midnight took a step forward. He lowered his head cautiously and sniffed the apple again, then, as though testing it, nudged it closer with his nose. Emma's heart soared. She didn't dare speak, afraid the moment would break. Midnight didn't trust her fully yet, but he was taking the first step. Emma had no intention of giving up. She would show him kindness until he could see her for what she was, a friend. With each passing day, Emma continued to offer Midnight the apples, the carrots, the gentle words. And slowly, so slowly, he began to trust her more. His steps grew less hesitant. His eyes softened, no longer filled with suspicion. Emma knew this was just the beginning. It would take time, patience, and love, but they would heal together. The road ahead would be long, but Emma believed they could make it through. She had kept her promise to Midnight, and now, she would earn his trust, one small step at a time. The wind howled, fierce and biting, as dark clouds gathered overhead. Midnight stood in the field, his body tense, his eyes darting nervously. The first clap of thunder rumbled through the air, shaking the ground beneath his hooves. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring. The storm was coming, and with it, the memories he couldn't escape. Every crack of thunder echoed in Midnight's mind like a whip against his flesh, the flash of lightning like a burning brand against his skin. The pain of his past rushed back, dark memories of the cruel hands that had once controlled him, of the fear that had consumed him day after day. The memories were suffocating, relentless, and they made him tremble. Without warning, he bolted. His body surged forward, the storm a blur in his frantic mind. The pounding rain stung his coat, but it was nothing compared to the terror that surged through him. He needed to run, needed to escape the storm, and the memories that followed him. Emma had been standing just a few feet away, watching Midnight's nervous movements, unsure of what to do. But before she could react, Midnight's panic overtook him. In a blind rush, he darted toward her, knocking her to the ground in his desperate flight. Emma cried out in shock as he skidded away, his hooves slipping in the mud. For a moment, Emma lay there, stunned, her heart racing. She struggled to her feet, fear crawling up her spine as she watched Midnight tear across the field. The storm raged, and Midnight was lost in the chaos of his past and present. She ran after him, calling his name, but his fear was too great. Midnight was fighting not just the storm but the ghosts that haunted him. And Emma could only watch as the bond they'd worked so hard to build seemed to shatter before her eyes. Emma sat on the barn floor, tears streaming down her face. The barn was quiet, the storm outside still raging, but inside, there was only silence. Midnight had finally calmed down after his panicked flight, but Emma couldn't shake the image of his wild, fearful eyes. She could still feel the panic that had surged through him, and the terror that had gripped her own heart when he had knocked her over. She had tried so hard. She had fought for Midnight, spent every moment caring for him, believing that together they could heal. But now, after everything, after the storm, it felt like nothing had changed. Midnight's fear was still as strong as ever. The bond she had hoped to build felt fragile, slipping through her fingers like sand. "I'm not enough," Emma whispered to herself, her voice breaking. Her shoulders slumped as she buried her face in her hands. What had she been thinking? She was just a young girl. What did she really know about healing a horse so broken? Her heart ached for Midnight. His pain was deeper than anything she could fix, and the more she tried, the more it seemed like she was failing. She thought of all the things she had sacrificed, all the time and effort she had put in, only to see Midnight slip further away. The weight of her doubt pressed heavily on her chest. She wondered if she had made a mistake. Was she really the one who could save him? Or was she just another person who had let him down? As Emma sat in the quiet barn, lost in her doubts, her father appeared in the doorway. He had been watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to step in. He had seen the storm in Emma's eyes, the hopelessness that had taken root inside her. But he knew something she didn't. He knew that healing would take time, and Midnight's journey would be long. He sat down beside her, offering her a comforting presence. "Emma," he began softly, "healing isn't easy. Especially for an animal like Midnight, who's been through so much. You can't expect him to trust you overnight. It's going to take patience. It's going to take time." Emma wiped her eyes, her heart still heavy with doubt. "But what if I'm not enough? What if I'm failing him?" Her father placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're not failing him. You're showing him something he's never had before, a chance at something better. Midnight is still learning to trust, to believe. You just have to keep showing him that you're here for him, no matter what." Emma looked up at her father, his words sinking deep into her heart. The road ahead would be hard, but she couldn't give up. Midnight needed her, and she wasn't going to let him down. The days had been long, and Emma's patience was wearing thin. Midnight was still hesitant, still retreating when she got too close, his eyes filled with fear. No matter how many times she approached him with kindness, it was as though the wall between them was growing thicker. She had tried everything she knew, but nothing seemed to break through. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the world quieted, Emma sat on the soft grass next to Midnight's stable. She watched him from the distance, his gaze distant and wary, and something inside her gave way. The usual strength she wore like armor started to fade. She wasn't sure what to do anymore, and the weight of it all pressed on her chest. She reached out to Midnight, her voice soft and trembling. "I know what it's like to be afraid," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I've been let down too, by people I trusted. It's hard to let someone in when they've hurt you before. I get it. I know what it feels like to be alone in your fear." Midnight's ears flicked toward her, his body still. She could almost feel the quiet listening between them. His eyes softened for a moment, as if he was hearing something he had never heard before. Then, as if in response to her own vulnerable confession, Midnight took a small step forward. His hooves moved slowly across the dirt, his body tense but determined. With careful, deliberate steps, he reached Emma and, for the first time, nuzzled her gently. The movement was hesitant, as though he wasn't sure he was allowed to trust, but the gesture spoke volumes. It was the first real sign of trust between them. Emma's heart swelled in her chest, and she reached out to him, placing her hand on his trembling neck. It was a small victory, but it meant everything. Days turned into weeks, and Emma never gave up. Each day, she showed Midnight that she could be trusted. Sometimes, they would spend hours just being together, Emma sitting quietly while Midnight grazed nearby. Other times, she would sit in the barn, reading aloud to him or singing soft songs, trying to ease the restlessness she could feel in him. Slowly but surely, Midnight began to show signs of change. His initial hesitation started to fade. When Emma reached out, he no longer recoiled. Instead, he accepted her touch, standing still as she brushed his coat, his dark eyes watching her with growing calm. He would even rest his head on her shoulder sometimes, an unspoken thank you for her patience. The walls between them were crumbling, one gentle moment at a time. Emma's heart soared with each small victory. It wasn't easy, there were still days when Midnight would pull away, his fear too strong to overcome. But Emma refused to give up. She could see the glimmer of hope in Midnight's eyes now, the spark of trust that had been missing before. One evening, as they worked together in the field, Emma's father approached them. He had been watching the progress from afar, and his eyes shone with pride. "You've done it," he said simply. Emma looked at Midnight, who was now walking beside her, calm and steady. "We're not done yet," she replied with a smile, though the doubt she once felt had started to fade. And then came the decision, the local horse competition. It wasn't about winning. It was about showing the world what they had accomplished together. Emma's heart raced with nervous excitement as she prepared Midnight for the event. The competition wasn't about trophies or ribbons, but a testament to how far they had come, both physically and emotionally. It symbolized the journey they had shared, the struggles, the breakthroughs, the quiet moments of trust. It wasn't about victory. It was about proving to themselves that healing was possible. Emma looked at Midnight, her hand resting on his neck. "We've made it this far," she whispered. "Together, we'll take this next step." And for the first time in a long time, Emma knew they were ready. The competition ground was bustling with excitement, but to Emma, nothing else mattered. It was just her and Midnight, side by side, as they took their turn in front of the judges and the crowd. The arena was filled with horses, each one more polished than the next, yet it was Midnight who stood out in her eyes. His coat, once dull and matted from neglect, now shone with the effort they'd put in together. His eyes, once full of fear, now held a quiet confidence, a testament to the journey they'd made. As they moved through the course, Midnight's hooves struck the ground with steady rhythm. Though his past threatened to creep in, he kept pushing forward. There were moments of hesitation, of unease, but Emma's calm voice guided him, just as she always had. Together, they danced through the course, their bond visible to everyone watching. The crowd held its breath, not for a perfect performance, but for the undeniable strength that pulsed between them. When they finished, they weren't first place, but their performance was met with a resounding applause. It wasn't about the trophy. It was about how far they had come. Midnight stood tall, no longer the fearful horse he once was, but a horse who had faced his past and risen above it. With Emma beside him, he had found the courage to trust again. And that, more than any ribbon, was a victory. The clapping of hands filled the air, but to Emma and Midnight, it was more than just applause. It was the recognition of a journey, a shared journey that neither of them had ever expected. They didn't win the competition, but the real victory was in the way Midnight had stepped forward with confidence, the way he had moved through the course, unshackled by the trauma of his past. The bond they had forged together shone brighter than any trophy. Emma felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she looked at Midnight. The crowd's cheers echoed in her chest, but they didn't matter the way the quiet connection between them did. In that moment, she realized something deeper than any prize. This wasn't about ribbons or judges' scores, this was about how far Midnight had come, how much trust they had built together. The old fear that once ruled his life had been replaced by a new strength, a strength born of love, patience, and time. The true triumph was not the applause, but the understanding that their healing had come from something deeper than the competition. Emma knew now that winning wasn't about being first. It was about the bond they shared, the trust they had rebuilt, and the strength they'd found in one another. As Emma stood beside Midnight, her heart swelled with gratitude. She gently stroked his neck, looking deep into his eyes. "You'll never face abuse again," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. She could see the fear that once haunted him fading away, replaced by a sense of safety, a place where love and trust could flourish. In that moment, Emma knew they had both healed, not just from time, but from the power of love and understanding. Midnight's journey was far from over, but together, they would face whatever came next. Emma's promise to him wasn't just a statement, it was a bond that would never be broken. Their journey together had only just begun, and Emma was ready for every step, every challenge that lay ahead. They were more than just a girl and a horse, they were a testament to the healing power of love. As Emma watched Midnight, her heart filled with a quiet peace. They had come so far, and it was hard to imagine the pain and fear that once consumed him. Now, his spirit was free, free from the chains of his past, free to trust, and free to love. It was in this trust, in this bond, that their healing had truly begun. She reflected on how Midnight had taught her just as much as she had taught him. In his quiet strength, she had learned the power of compassion, the importance of never giving up, and the strength that comes from vulnerability. The world around them seemed brighter now, filled with hope. Emma knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. With love, patience, and trust, they had proven that even the most broken spirits could heal. And in that, Emma found her own strength, a strength born from the bond they shared. If you were moved by Midnight and Emma's journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. Join us as we explore the incredible bond between animals and humans, and how love, trust, and courage can heal even the most broken spirits.